if you understand a little bit how the FBI thinks and how they actually act, maybe that can be helpful to you in confronting these issues and confronting the FBI, because I firmly believe and believed when I was an FBI agent that I was there to serve the community. And it's their responsibility to serve you and not treat you as a suspect community just because of your religion or where you come from. And you know, unfortunately, I think what drives a lot of the FBI's activities post 9/11 is ignorance within the FBI. One thing to keep in mind is, just as the community is not a monolith, we're all made up of individuals from different places, the FBI is the same, and all law enforcement is the same. It's individuals. One of the things I hear a lot when I go out and talk to community groups is they'll say, you know, we got along very well with the FBI for a period of time, and then all of a sudden something changed, and all of a sudden, you know, they weren't responsive to our concerns. They didn't want to meet with us to hear about the problems. They were very cold and aggressive when they met with it. And typically what that is just a change in management. You know, the way the FBI's management structure works, the special agent in charge and the assistant special agents in charge and the supervisors move fairly regularly, about every 2 or 3 years. So if you have somebody who is you know, well informed on these issues, they, you know, understand the community better and understand their roles better, they move away, and some new person comes in who maybe is influenced by some of the bad training that we've seen. One of the things I was sort of shocked by, because when I left the FBI in 2004, I was in their behavioral sciences unit doing some counterterrorism training, and to see how, I don't know if everyone saw it, but over the last several years that I was at the ACLU before I came to the Brennan Center, we had obtained through the Freedom of Information Act a lot of FBI counterterrorism training that reflected a strong anti-Muslim bias and you know, just very flawed training that they were putting on. And unfortunately, this training, there were a number of bad trainers who put on some really, I mean, racist sort of training programs, and not just for the Muslim community, for many different political advocacy groups and racial groups. That's really shocking training material that was out there. But even in their more professional and more formal training programs, they have a lot of bad information about terrorism. And I worked terrorism for a number of years, including going undercover in domestic terrorist groups like neo-Nazi groups and far-right extremist groups. And the sort of the popular conception of how terrorism works is based on flawed assumptions. And rather than doing empirical studies and understanding truly how this behavior works in society, they've instead sort of developed this very simple model that says, you know, terrorism goes along this pathway where you start out as a believer, you become an activist, you become, you know, more involved in your ideology, and then you become a terrorist. None of that is based on empirical studies. In fact, empirical studies show quite the opposite, that there is no simple pathway. And that's what I found in my cases. I mean, you know, when I was undercover in neo-Nazi groups, there were some people within the criminal element who, you know, understood the philosophy and thought that what they were doing was furthering the philosophy. And there were some who didn't know any of it and were there because they liked making bombs, and here was a group that let them make bombs. A lot of the people were there because, you know, their parents were part of the movement and brought them in. A lot of the people were there because their parents hated the movement and they were rebelling against their parents. You know, it was very individual, just as, you know, if we went around this room or you went around an FBI office and said, how did you choose this profession, you'd find very different pathways. It's no different there. And unfortunately, because the FBI has adopted this radicalization model, it justifies this idea that, well, you know, the terrorists are very hard to find, and thankfully there are very few of them, but the pool that the terrorist comes from is just up this pathway. So it's a lot easier for us to go and look at the people in the belief community, even though that's, again, based on flawed reasoning and flawed science. So, but that's what drives a lot of the activity, and it's part of their formal training. And unfortunately, when we exposed the bias training, the FBI went and removed 800 pages from their training material, which is probably some of the worst stuff, hopefully. They haven't been very transparent about what they removed. But we asked specifically to remove the documents about this radicalization theory, and they refused to. And unfortunately, what we're seeing now is that this theory is permeating the judiciary as well. We've seen a couple of court decisions where, in one of the entrapment cases, the judge argued that, well, because this person had this ideology, then they're not entrapped, right? It's natural and appropriate for the government to go and set that person up because they had the ideology and therefore were predestined to become terrorists. So this was just the government helping them along, which, you know, the facts of that case were pretty egregious, where the defendant was actually, the informant actually couldn't get the person to do the terrorist act by appealing to ideology, and so instead offered $250,000 if he would do it. So this, in fact, wasn't terrorism at all, but murder for hire. You know, and this was in an impoverished community where there weren't a lot of economic opportunities, and to put that kind of bait out there is simply inappropriate for the government to be doing. We've also seen a judge in a case in New Jersey where the NYPD was spying on the community say, well, since the community is the pool from which the terrorists come from, then it's perfectly appropriate for the police to spy on the community. And again, this is based on this flawed assumption that there is this pathway that goes from the community to terrorism, which is not true. So part of, I think, the response has to be to understand how this theory influences the policy, and to have at hand all the empirical studies that show it's not true. And it's not just, you know, there are a number of groups out there that have put out studies, including the Brennan Center where I work now. There's a new book coming out called The Muslims Are Coming by Arun Kudnandi that also destroys this theory. He was an academic researcher in Britain when Britain was using this methodology, spying on the community, something they called prevent. And unfortunately, it was a disaster in Britain, so the US authorities decided, great, we'll bring that here. And luckily, Arun, who had done a lot of the studies showing how disastrous it was in Britain, also came here. But there are other groups like even RAND, the RAND Corporation, which puts out a lot of government documents, has done some good studies that show that this idea that there is this simple pathway is just completely flawed and doesn't justify the type of activities they're going to. And of course, the worst of these are these entrapment cases where FBI, I mean, first, a lot of the problems in the community are driven by the FBI's recruitment and use of informants. And, you know, I know that many of you, and when I travel around the country, and I know Zahra hears from a lot of people who are being, you know, it's always hard because it's hard, you know, the informants are secret, so we don't know who they are. And the FBI claims, you know, we don't indiscriminately send informants in, except that we've seen enough court cases now to know they do. In the one case I was talking about where the informant offered $250,000, in his testimony in that trial, he said, yes, I was just sent to this mosque to sort of spy on everyone until I found somebody who I could convince to do something. So similarly, in Southern California, there's an informant who came forward and said, yes, I was sent to all the area mosques just to collect as much information about the community as I could. There are a number of other cases like that. But also, we hear from so many people in the community who are approached to be informants. So, you know, if they come to me and say, I want you to be an informant in the Brennan Center, that's, even if I say, no, thank you, I'd don't have anything to report about the Brennan Center, that would certainly leave me with the impression that there may be other informants in the Brennan Center, because obviously the FBI is interested in having informants there. Part of it is driven by internal requirements within the FBI that require them to have informants. So if you're an FBI agent and you're assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Omaha, Nebraska, and there's no terrorism in Omaha, Nebraska, and therefore not a lot to do, that doesn't relieve you of the obligation to have informants. So they have to go out and find an informant who's going to tell them something, and using this radicalization theory, they go to the community and say, well, just tell me anything about the community. And so I think a lot of the aggressiveness is that requirement, where they don't, I think if they sat down and talked honestly, they wouldn't really expect that this informant is going to give them anything of value, but just that they have to fulfill the requirement. There was an Inspector General investigation of the FBI's investigation of domestic advocacy groups, because a lot of political groups, this radicalization theory works for a lot of different political philosophies as well, that the animal rights movement, for instance, yes, there are a small number of people who in furtherance of animal rights have engaged in criminal activity. So they say, well, then anybody who is an animal rights activist is therefore the pool from which these people come from. And have done the similarly aggressive sort of entrapment cases and surveillance of those communities. And what they find is that, this type of, I think the Muslim community is under the most serious stress from this, but what always happens in these national security crises is that emergency techniques and extraordinary measures taken because of the crisis become normalized and start being used in other types of investigations, and that's sort of the stage we're at. The good news of that is that I think a wider group of people, and particularly political activists, are understanding how this works and pushing back against it. So hopefully there will be more public awareness of how damaging this is, because of course part of what the FBI's history is, when you go back to the 1960s and 50s when they were doing this a lot, was to try to suppress First Amendment activity, to suppress social change, to suppress the discussion of ideas that they were afraid of. And I think that's a big part of what this does, because once the community has to worry about who is an informant and whether there's an informant, it creates a lot of division within the groups and makes things very difficult, when really what has to happen is all the communities have to come together as one and join and require of their elected representative to, both at the state, local, state, federal level, let them know what your concerns are, so that they can put pressure on these agencies, because the FBI is only 14,000 agents. It's not, and that's worldwide. So it's not a very big organization. It is very dependent on state and local law enforcement to help them with a lot of the law enforcement and intelligence work they do. And if state and local governments start putting pressure on the FBI to stop these kind of tactics, they'll be responsive. And so one of the other problems that we've seen, and with that same Freedom of Information Act request, we got out of the FBI, the documents that we weren't actually expecting, I was kind of surprised to see them, were that they were exploiting community outreach for intelligence purposes. And I'm sure many of you have seen those documents. If you haven't, we can send around a list of links that we published, where over the course of time, so there's basically two separate programs. There's a legitimate community outreach program the FBI runs through its public affairs division. And that is entirely appropriate and legitimate, and I think something that the FBI has a responsibility to do, right? I mean, they can't serve the public unless they understand what the public's concerns are. So it's very important for them to engage in that activity. But the problem is, over the course of a few years, they decided that this was something they could exploit for intelligence reasons, and started actually creating a separate intelligence program that was mirroring the community outreach. So they would go pretending to be community outreach, but actually be intelligence agents collecting information. And if you've seen any of those documents, it's the most innocuous material that is deeply personal. You know, if some person happened to be sitting at the table next to the FBI agent and talking about their family, talking about their travel history, their financial history, that all gets documented in an FBI file where clearly we were able to obtain it, so it's retrievable perhaps by any agent who then, when for some reason they get suspicious of you, either based on this bad training or this radicalization theory, they have this trove of information to start going through. And one of the more dangerous aspects is that they use this Al Capone theory, Al Capone being the Chicago gangster who committed murders and extortion and every other kind of violent crime. But the FBI, actually it was the Treasury Department, but the Treasury Department ultimately got him for tax evasion. So, you know, they saw that as a victory. We would put this murderer in jail for something far less serious than what he did, but at least it got him off the streets. And unfortunately, they're now using this Al Capone tactic to go after people who they have suspicions of that they're dangerous, but they don't have any evidence. Well, as an FBI agent, what I found was typically when I didn't have any evidence somebody was dangerous, that was because they weren't. And you left it at that. But unfortunately, because they have, again, this bias training and this radicalization theory, they have this flawed idea of who is dangerous and therefore can justify it. And I sort of saw it in the FBI where, you know, because of the success I had had as an agent, I was fairly popular and well known in the FBI. But when I started reporting wrongdoing within the FBI, all of a sudden I became a target, and they started going through trying to find anything they could find to justify doing some kind of, imposing some sort of punishment on me. And it sort of gave me a sense of how it feels when you've come under that microscope. That
welcome to our club.
Right, exactly. And the FBI actually even had a saying internally that nobody's administratively pure. And that if you start going through somebody's records with a fine-tooth comb, eventually you'll find something out of order that either you can, the way the FBI works, either they can hold that over your head to compel you to become an informant against the community, or actually prosecute you selectively for that. So, you know, we've seen cases where minor discrepancies on immigration papers from decades ago or some other government filing all of a sudden get raised to the level of, this is a false statement on a government form and we're going to prosecute you for it, when there's no other situation in which they would do that. And they've used that to deport people, they've used that to imprison people. So there are very serious consequences for this type of activity, and it has a very deleterious effect on the community. So it's very important for you, when you have interactions with the FBI, and I'm sure you all know this, to work with lawyers and to make sure that either CAIR or the ACLU or some other private attorney is with you to make sure that you're protecting yourself, because that's your right. And, you know, I think we all want the same thing, right? We all want to live in a safe environment where we have the opportunity to work and be productive, and most importantly, to have an environment for our children to grow up in where they're safe and secure and have opportunities. And in order to accomplish that, we need effective law enforcement. And it's their obligation to provide that for you. So, you know, it's very important that we hold them to their responsibilities and treat the community as the community they serve, rather than one that they just treat with suspicion. So one of the things that, with the community outreach, with the training, you know, they acknowledged that there were some problems and fixed at least some of them. Unfortunately, with the community outreach, they haven't been very responsive. So you know, to the extent that there is community outreach going on still, or you have an opportunity to interact with the FBI, I would take the documents, you know, because it's interesting how they, in meetings I've had with them, they'll say, we don't do that. It's like, I have documents, you know, they're your documents. I didn't write these documents, you know, obviously you're doing it. And again, there are two systems. So we've had meetings with community outreach people who say, we don't do that. Well, I know you don't do that. They have nice, very good policy within the true community outreach group that segregates any records they collect. So obviously, when they go out and do something, they have to keep track of who they're talking to. But they keep those segregated so they're not in the searchable files. So if an FBI agent wants to know something about somebody the community outreach met with, they can't just find that. Where what I would say to them is, well, your intelligence division is mimicking your program and undermining it, because the whole purpose of your program is to build trust and community engagement, and if you have the intelligence agency pretending to be you but doing something very different, it'll destroy that trust. And they just sort of shrug their shoulders and say, well, we can't control the intelligence division, so, you know, there's nothing we can do about it. So, you know, I think it will require confronting the FBI with the evidence of this program and just saying, look, you know, we believe that you have a responsibility to serve our community, and we want you to do that in an open and transparent way, and we want to make sure this doesn't happen and hold them to account that way. So I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. Hopefully I've...
Can you touch a little bit about FBI involvement with the no-fly list, if there is anything?
Yes, there is quite a bit. The FBI, through the National Counterterrorism Center, controls most of the terrorism watch lists, and there are a number of different lists, which is part of the problem. And very opaque criteria for getting on or off the list. And unfortunately, every time they do an Inspector General review of it, what they find is that the FBI is not very good at, I mean, really mismanages the list from a lot of degrees. Even if you're only concerned from a security standpoint, they have cases and known terrorists who, when they do the examination, aren't on the list. And yet then, you know, thousands of people who have no business being on these lists are put on them. And they claim that there is a criteria that requires a reasonable belief. But that is a very, very low threshold. It's less than the threshold of probable cause, which is what they would need to get a warrant to search you. So they can put you on a list with less evidence than they could search your house. The no-fly list is a subset of the Terrorist Screening Center list. Right now, they say it's somewhere around 14,000 people on the no-fly list versus about 1.1 million names on the Terrorist Screening Center list. So, huge problem. There was just a case here in California where a Stanford graduate student had been placed on the list and actually arrested at the airport, and then allowed to fly out of the country, but not allowed to fly back into the country. And she was a very courageous woman who sued and fought for 8 years, and it finally turned out it was an FBI agent's error. He had accidentally checked the wrong box. So, you know, when that kind of you know, it doesn't surprise me that that kind of error can happen, but that there's no process to catch it. There's no process to continually revise the list to make sure that there's still a reason to have somebody on it. And not only that there's not that process to check it, but that the Justice Department would fight for 8 years to prevent this woman from finding out how she got on the list when, and it seemed clear according to the court records that the agent himself didn't realize he had put her on the list. So when he goes to the court hearing at his deposition and they say, why did you put this woman on the list? He says, I didn't. And they show him the record and he realizes for the first time, oh, I thought I was supposed to check that box if she wasn't on the list. And so, you know, it sort of shows how dangerous this is, where there's no due process, there's no ability to check it, there's no outside accountability for what the FBI is doing. And you know, as a former agent, there are dangerous people out there. There are bad people in our communities doing damage, and the FBI and state and local law enforcement have an important job to do to go after them. I mean, one of the shocking things that I found recently just doing a report on the FBI at the ACLU, half the violent crime in this country goes unsolved. A third of the murders, almost 60% of the rapes. There are somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 rape kits that haven't been processed because there's a backlog in the police labs. You know, those are things that all of these resources that they're using to do this unnecessary spying should be devoted to. And that would make all of our communities safer from myriad threats. You know, there isn't just one threat out there, unfortunately. There are a lot of different threats that they have a responsibility to. You know, I don't tend to believe in conspiracies, that there's sort of, I think what it is there's a lot of ignorance. And unfortunately, the way the intelligence community operated after 9/11 was, rather than reach out to the people who knew what they were doing, they promoted people who would implement whatever program they were interested in doing. You know, and certainly we know now, you know, there was the immediate rush to go out and arrest Muslim immigrants.
500 people.
Yeah, I think more than that even. I mean, there were a lot of people ended up arrested who posed no threat. They did it, I think.
So that was the first sweep they did, right after that.
Right, exactly. And you know, deported a lot of people, not because they were actually a threat. My understanding is there was no terrorism-related prosecutions out of upwards of 1,500 arrests. So, you know, we know that there was the mosque counting initiative that the FBI sent out to count the number of mosques, as if that would somehow tell them something about the threat. You know, the going around to the mosques with the radiation detectors, you know, all this, that demonstrates a very troubling racial attitudes and religious animus that was driving part of it. But again, I think it was more out of ignorance than anything else.
Well, the Time magazine reporter came here.
Yeah.
And I was giving khutbah at that time.
Right.
So she came to me and she said that on the side, and she said, "You look like a very nice person, you know, a very honest person. Could you, you know, for my career, could you give me some hint, identify some sleeping cell?"
Right.
And I told her, I was equally serious. I said, "Yeah, I know one sleeping cell for sure." And I slept with my wife.
Yeah.
She was so shocked.
And
This is kind of attitude of, not only in the government,
right.
but in the private sector.
Right. I mean, I was talking to a researcher who promotes this radicalization idea, who happens to be white male, and he was saying, you know, well, the community is not as cooperative as they could be in identifying potential threats. And I said, well, how many white supremacist terrorists have you turned in? And he looks at me and he goes, well, I don't. And it's like, well, you're white. You must know the white supremacist terrorists. Why would you? And you know, and that I think sort of started to settle in. That, you know, the FBI would never go to Christian churches and say, tell us who the Ku Klux Klansmen are. Even though the Ku Klux Klan uses the cross as their symbol, you know, they consider themselves Christians, because the Christian churches would say that's not part of us. That's not part of our community. Well, it's no different with this community, but, you know, again, because of these problematic attitudes they have. And you know, with the racial attitudes, it's not just Muslims, Arabs, South Asians. I mean, we see this material with, we obtained some documents where the FBI actually has a racial and ethnic mapping program where they make these sort of crass stereotypes about what type of crime different racial groups commit to justify mapping all the communities across the nation where they live. And, you know, the only reason they want to map the separate racial groups is because they want to treat them differently. I mean, what would be the purpose of mapping them and then saying, okay, now work based on reasonable suspicion of criminal activity? What would the map be for? It's because they're going to treat them differently. And, you know, again, it just reflects you know, especially for an organization that's supposed, you know, law enforcement is supposed to be based on evidence. And the idea that these programs and policies are put in place based on these flawed notions and racist ideas, I think, is extremely troubling. And, you know, the way a watch list works, well, if you have 1.1 million names on a list, they're going to be, you know, 10 times that number of people whose names are very similar to those names. And so it's this exponential problem. And, you know, then they have these programs like the See Something, Say Something program. Well, and actually, you know, define what is suspicious. So they say things like photography or videotaping, inherently suspicious and related to terrorism. Note-taking, you know, I think I saw somebody taking some notes. You know, that note-taking is inherently suspicious and related to terrorism. So, of course, there's nothing suspicious about videotaping or photography or note-taking or taking measurements, you know, these really odd things, but it's because they want people to report anything they're suspicious of. Well, what they end up reporting isn't that there is a suspicious activity, but that they're suspicious of somebody because of their race, because of their religion, because of their political activity. And that's what we've seen. We've obtained through the Freedom of Information Act a lot of these suspicious activity reports, and it is, you know, Middle Eastern appearing man taking a photograph of a bridge, where taking a photograph of a bridge isn't suspicious. I mean, they hire architects to build pretty bridges, right? I mean, it's crazy. The FBI's program actually suggested, when it initiated, it's called eGuardian, it sort of had this hypothetical situation. You know, imagine somebody sees somebody taking a picture of the George Washington Bridge in New York City, and the police officer checks and finds out that same person had taken a picture of the Washington Monument. You know, oh my gosh, you know, it must be a terrorist that he's taking a picture of two of the most iconic places in America. And, you know, there's a $30 bus that will take you from one to another in a number of hours. So I'm sure that there are hundreds of thousands of people who have taken pictures both of the George Washington Bridge and the Washington Monument, but they've created this idea that somehow will help them solve terrorist cases. And there's no evidence that's true. They've never done any study that shows that this is a valuable methodology. And what happens is all that information gets collected into these vast federal databases at the Director of National Intelligence Information Sharing Environment and at the FBI, where you can never clear that suspicion, right? There's no way you can prove somebody won't become a terrorist. So, you know, how that ends up either putting you on a list or having some other impact on your life, or even, you know, setting up one of these interviews where they come and knock on your door or show up at your workplace, and, you know, very intimidating. So, and because they have this Al Capone theory, you know, if in trying to assist the FBI in understanding better what's going on, there's some slight factual mistake that's made in your presentation, they can then hold that over your head and perhaps even prosecute you for it. So very important, again, to make sure that when you have these interactions with law enforcement, that you have legal representation with you. One of the other things we see a lot, particularly when Muslim Americans are returning to the country from abroad, they get questioned about their religious beliefs. How many times do you pray? You know, what charities do you give contributions to? These, again, totally inappropriate for a law enforcement agent to be collecting this type of information. But it's because of this radicalization theory. They believe, based on this theory, that if you pray more often, you're more dangerous. That if you go to Friday prayers, you're more dangerous, because wouldn't a normal person be out having a good time on a Friday night instead of going to prayers? I mean, it's this silly approach, but they, you know, you can read it in their training documents that they believe it. You know, one of the more troubling ones, there's an FBI textbook, counterterrorism textbook, that says if you meet a Muslim, you should question him, and actually has a script. What do you feel about the Iraq War? What do you feel about the situation in Israel and Palestine? What do you think of the situation in Egypt? And then it says, if they answer in a pro-Western patriotic way, they could probably be used as an informant. but the implication being if they don't, they might be a militant. And it's really sort of ridiculous stuff, but unfortunately it's what drives a lot of this behavior. And again, I think it's just ignorance more than conspiracy. So number one, I would make sure they're educated on the issues so that they have the documents, so you can go to them and say, you know, look at this, would you please talk to the FBI about this? And if the FBI won't conform their behavior, you don't have, you know, the state and local legislators don't have control over the FBI, but they do have control over state and local officials. And what happened in Portland is when the FBI changed their rules, the Portland City Council said, well, we're not going to participate in FBI counterterrorism investigations if the FBI is playing by those rules because our standards are higher. And you know, you would think it's Portland, Oregon, small city, you know, not really a big deal. When it came back up for renewal, the ACLU asked me to come out to testify, and there in the room is the FBI General Counsel, an Associate Attorney General from the Department of Justice. They were taking it very seriously, this idea that this little city would say, we're not going to play by your rules. So, you know, we've worked with the city of San Francisco to get them to pass an ordinance because San Francisco has a city ordinance that limits their police interaction with people for political reasons, and got an ordinance strengthened to try to limit the police cooperation. And that's something that will make it very difficult because, again, the FBI is only 14,000 agents. They don't have enough people to do the type of intelligence collection they want, so they rely on the state and locals. And if the state and locals won't play along, it makes their job much more difficult. So hopefully what will happen if we can keep that going is that they'll have to conform their policies so that the state and locals will continue to work with it. When somebody has some immigration issue pending, they often get visited by the FBI who will say, oh, we understand you applied for citizenship. We can help you, which of course implies we can make sure you don't. And we've seen a lot of cases where people get stalled, where nothing seems to happen. So the ACLU of Southern California actually published a report about 6 months ago, maybe 8 months ago, on a, until then, secret program where the FBI could put a hold on any immigration proceeding, a secret hold based on national security reasons, of course, that they didn't have to explain or provide some basis for. And the person whose immigration procedures are being delayed would never get any notice, no opportunity to challenge whatever the evidence is that they're holding them up for. And what we've seen is that they're using that to pressure people to become informants. Again, I think a lot of it is not because they actually think there's a problem, but just that they have to have informant. Here's somebody who requires something from the government, so easy person for us to exploit. What we've actually started seeing recently, which is even more problematic, is when Americans travel abroad, that, you know, they'll get on a plane, fly somewhere, go on vacation, see their family, whatever. When they come back to the airport after their vacation, they find out they're on the no-fly list, and now stranded in a foreign country, away from, you know, family and friends who could help them, legal representation, and compelled to go to the embassy to try to work it out, only to see 2 FBI agents waiting for them, saying, hey, we can get you off the list. You know, the FBI is involved in the watch listing and in creating these national security holds on immigration, so I'm sure that there was some, but you know, clearly the FBI is not the only bad actor, whether it's the TSA, whether it's DHS, whether it's Customs, you know, they're, you know, and again, when you see these training programs that the FBI was putting on, we've also seen them at the military, we've seen them at the Justice Department, we've seen them at DHS. So, you know, it's a government-wide problem that this bias training has been out there for so long. And, you know, we had it documented from 2003 to 2011. So you can imagine how many FBI agents, DHS agents, military personnel, the state and local law enforcement went through those training programs for almost 10 years. And there's just, you know, I mean, you just have to go down to the bookstore and see the books that, you know, have these Islamophobic theories in them. So, you know, unfortunately that information is prevalent out there, and rather than dispelling that within the intelligence community, they actually promote it too often. And I mean, clearly there are real threats, and if they took all this effort and energy and actually worked on evidence-based investigations, they'd be far more successful in identifying them and not impose undue restrictions on people who aren't a threat to anyone. I mean, it's really astonishing. And you know, part of the thing to keep in mind is this isn't something new, right? I mean, the FBI has been through this, you know, before, during, and after World War II. They did the same thing. The first radicalization hearing in Congress was in 1917, you know, and they were targeting the labor organizers at the time and civil rights groups like the ACLU. And the Panthers then in the 1960s. So it's the same sort of overreaction to a national security threat, but rather than learn from that history, unfortunately, they're repeating it. And you know, you know, and the list of problems is so long. You know, torture and Guantanamo and drones and you know all these things that there's no basis for believing that that's actually improving our national security or keeping anyone safer, and yet to talk about that is considered inappropriate. You know, when you read these materials about radicalization, they don't talk about any of that. You know, they don't talk about anything where it would actually imply that there's flaws in U.S. policy. It's really sort of astonishing how the whole theory is set up to say the problem is outside. The problem is them and not, you know, and these communities and these rabble-rousers and political activists are the problem, not anything that maybe the government is overreacting on. So the question for the tape is about informants and whether there's a pattern. And unfortunately for the advocacy around the issue, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what the FBI considers informants. You know, and the term is extraordinarily broad. I mean, there are a lot of people in the community who see somebody who's doing harm, who call the FBI and say, this person's a problem, and they're doing a community service, and you know, they're reporting somebody who's actually a criminal doing harm. Right, exactly. Exactly, so there's this spectrum. And you know, there are some informants in the middle of the spectrum who, you know, are aggressive in going out, and then there's some informants like the one in New York who, you know, is bribing people to commit crimes so that he can get a checkbox by his name. You know, I don't think that there's any pattern. You know, they're just like anything else. They come from all walks of life. And can be anywhere. You know, I mean.
I'm interested whether there are any restrictions. Whether the FBI considers anything fair game.
Who can't be an
So, to the extent there are restrictions, there are exceptions. Okay. You know, I mean, you know, Jackie Presser, it came out, was an FBI informant. You know, head of the Teamsters Union. So if the head of the Teamsters Union can be an informant, you know, that's a pretty good clue that, you know, it could be anyone. And you know, there are what the FBI calls sensitive investigative matters, and that typically involves where the subject of the investigation is a political official, where the news media is involved, where religious officials or organizations are involved. But all that requires is a higher level of approval within the FBI and Justice Department. So it's not like it's a prohibition. So, you know, what we saw in Southern California, where the informant came forward and said, you know, I was sent into all the mosques to just collect as many names and email addresses and phone numbers as I could grab. So, you know, if you looked at the rules, that would appear to be prohibited, but clearly it was going on. And, you know, again, there are other cases as well where when the people testify, they say, yes, you know, I was just sent into this community. I think in Ohio there was a case where it was a nonprofit where the informant said, yes, I was just sent into the community and told to keep my eyes and ears open. So, you know, clearly it's happening. You know, again, it's one of those areas where the FBI is being a little disingenuous in their response that, oh no, we only send people in where there's a factual basis to believe it, when what we've seen is that's not true. You know, FBI has long had, you know, it was sort of part of your training that the one thing that's going to get you in trouble is an FBI agent or informants, because what are they doing? They're betraying their friends and community. So, you know, the idea as an FBI agent that you become friendly with the informant is a little risky, because they could simply turn around and betray you as well. You know, typically when you have that kind of a pattern, what you do is draw very strong guidelines to make sure that there's not much room for getting in trouble, and then have enough accountability. And that's where I think that we have the problem here, is that the FBI is really accountable to no one at this point. And unfortunately, what we've seen when we see these cases go up into the courts, you know, in the case I mentioned with the $250,000, at the sentencing, the judge said, you know, this guy was a buffoon, and only the government could have turned him into a terrorist, but yet sentenced him to 25 years. So, you know, when the judge acknowledges that this was a completely manufactured case, but still sentence him, you know, that shows that there's not enough courage to challenge these programs, even within the judiciary, certainly within Congress. But that's why we have to work together as a community to make sure that we're pushing our concerns up the chain, so that everybody knows that this is something that the community is not accepting. And I think we're starting to see a change. I think, you know, when back in 2004, when these cases first started, it would really only be, you know, months later at the trial where things would start to leak out that maybe this person wasn't the dangerous terrorist the government alleges, where now, as soon as there's an arrest, the stories in the paper start that this person was not really a threat to anyone, that this was a manufactured case. So I think that, you know, unfortunately, anytime the government does overreach like this, it does more damage, because it damages their credibility. And, you know, again, there are real threats out there that they should be focused on, and this kind of nonsense actually hurts their ability to investigate those threats. Certainly we saw in the training materials reading lists of outside materials. That was sort of the Islamophobic industry's production. You know, and I'm a free speech kind of guy. I believe they have a right to put out whatever trash they want to put out. But when the government then endorses that, that's where the problem is. And, you know, they did a government-wide review of training programs, but for the amount of material that we got, 800 pages sounds like it might not be as thorough an examination. They also did a little bit of a word play where they said what they were examining wasn't their counterterrorism training, which is the material we had, but what they called cultural awareness training. So it's unclear whether all of even the worst of the material was taken out, and they've not at all been willing to show what they've taken out. So it's a big part of the problem. There were congressmen like Senator Durbin, who was very strong on the issue. So there are people to go to in Congress to say you need to do more oversight of this. You know, when you look at I mean, I think part of what has started to turn the pendulum the other way is the Edward Snowden documents, and to see the scope of what the government is doing, I think has shocked many Americans, and they're starting to demand some answers. And one of them was, how effective is any of this? And to find that they can't even point to one case, you know, this big telephone metadata collection that they've been doing for 10 years, more, like you say, 14 years, it never caught a terrorist. You know, hopefully there does seem to be some pressure to engage in some reform, so hopefully those will be comprehensive reforms that will also look at some of these other programs where they're harming the community. You know, one of the things that will destroy a community's unity and ability to work with one another is this mutual suspicion. And in fact, when the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was doing the COINTEL program, part of what they would do is put on somebody what they called a snitch jacket, where they would create a rumor that somebody's an informant, to destroy the organization, that the organization would start pointing fingers at each other and become destroyed. And in fact, I mean, did that very successfully with the Black Panthers, and it broke up into much smaller groups, some of which were much, much more violent. So it was really very counterproductive from a security posture. And it, you know, and this is where what the FBI is doing is so dangerous, because you know, it would be nice to be able to say, you know, if somebody's saying that, counsel them, right? And that's what the community exists for. When there's somebody who's having problems, we educate them, we counsel them, we explain to them why that's not good. But when you have to worry that this person is not really having a spiritual or political question, but actually just trying to find some basis for the government intervening in your life, it becomes more difficult to do that. And I've heard in some cases that people say, you know, we just shut them off and then feel bad about it, because maybe this is a person who just needed some help and the community could be able to help them and educate them. But the fear is that it's not, that it's a government intervention. So it's a very difficult problem. And, you know, I tend to believe that transparency is always the best, you know, sunlight's the best disinfectant, and bringing these problems out into the open and making sure that if there is somebody like that, that your colleagues and the leader in your organization, CAIR, ACLU, you know, are engaged. And so both that if there is a problem that we can identify it, but to do it in a way that's not so stigmatizing the person that if they are somebody who actually needs help, that they won't receive that help. I believe if any of us thought that there was somebody who was going to harm somebody, you know, we would of course do whatever was necessary to prevent that from happening. You know, in these situations, I mean, I don't think, you know, anybody hasn't been in a situation where somebody says something inappropriate at times, and, you know, I don't think we have to report to the FBI every time somebody says something in a peak of anger or something like that. But, you know, I mean, I just hate that this is the situation that the community has to wrestle with something like this. But, you know, certainly if there's something that has seriously troubled you, making sure you have good notes of what happened. And so, you know, when something comes up 6 months, a year later, and somebody says, hey, this incident happened, you can say, well, no, you know, it actually troubled me so much I took some notes, and here's what actually happened, and here's the contemporaneous notes that I took at the time. So you can't say something different happened than what actually happened. So
I want to say that the one flip side to, of course, the very dangerous person is also the experience that a lot of, and I've heard mostly about Caucasian converts to our community. Like I heard maybe a couple of months ago about a Caucasian convert who was assaulted at a masjid because someone thought, well, you must be an informant. I mean, most of the people in this room know my husband, who is also a Caucasian convert. I was advised not to marry him because he might be an informant by a community leader. And so the flip side is also that fear means that we're targeting a lot of very sort of innocent people. And then the specific steps that we advise organizations and community members who are encountering situations like this is, one, to take it up with the organization's leadership first, right? So if it's at a masjid, let the masjid board know. Second, go to the civil rights and advocacy groups. I mean, it'd be nice to think that we could call law enforcement right away, but when the consequences are that you could ruin someone's life, that's something that we want to be very cautious about. And then, of course, the thing that I think most of the masjid leaders know is that you can exclude people from your facilities. So if it is a masjid and there is someone who continues to come back, and not to put Omer on the spot, but Omer, correct me if I'm wrong, you could exclude that person from your facility without having to turn them in as a terrorist to the FBI. And so there's also a sort of a middle ground that protects the community without maybe putting the individual on the line in the same way.
And we know from the case in California that when the mosque went to the FBI and said, you know, this person's a problem, you know, if he's one of yours, please take him back. The FBI did not respond to that, and they actually had to go and get a restraining order to have this person leave them alone.
And now that person is suing the FBI.
Right. Our publishing the materials, compelled a government-wide review of their training materials that was supposed to identify at least the worst aspects of them. There has been a significant pushback in academia and in the advocacy community against this radicalization theory. There are plenty of studies out now that refute it. Unfortunately, the FBI and a lot of these other agencies cling to it like it's some security blanket for them. It's really astonishing to me that, the FBI is made up of very smart people. It's very difficult to get into the FBI. Why they would allow this material to persist, I can't really understand. There's actually, anybody ever heard of terror management studies? Has nothing to do with terrorism. It predated 9/11. It was a theory based on, the idea is mortality salience, that the one thing we all know as we go through our day is that one day we will die. And that is a horrifying thing to think about, so we don't think about it, and we just sort of put that idea out of our mind, which is how we can get in a car and drive. If you actually thought about how dangerous that is, you would never do it. But they've done studies where if you are given a reminder of your mortality before you have to make a decision, it very significantly changes your decision process to the point where they went to judges and they gave them a hypothetical prostitute to sentence. And if they gave them a reminder of their mortality before the sentencing, they would sentence them much more severely. And it created a very us and them sort of thinking, and a very moralistic sort of thinking, and a very punitive sort of thinking. That, when we see these TSA agents acting this way, it sort of fits that model of sort of reverting to the worst aspects of human nature rather than becoming thoughtful and reasonable about how they act. So I think that probably drives some of this behavior. Like this, I've been to a lot of CAIR events all around the country, and for an organization that has been targeted by a smear campaign for a long time, I think it's very important that the community stays around, because this is what happened in the 1960s too. I mean, it was going, and in the 19-teens when they went after the ACLU, that the idea is that the support groups that help the community and stand up for their rights are the ones that become targets. So it's very important that we all work together to make sure that we're supporting those community guardians that are protecting everybody's rights, because if we don't stand up for everyone's rights, none of our rights are secure. One is public education, making sure that everybody knows that, whether it's your children, whether it's, that, hey, if somebody comes up and they're saying things that seem inappropriate, you need to tell somebody. If somebody comes up and tries to get you to break away from the community and not engage with the community, that's a problem. You need to communicate with the leaders, you need to communicate with your families, and then educating your representatives. And, we've published tons of these documents and use them. And bring them to your representatives and say, look, this is what they're doing. And nobody can read these documents and think this is something appropriate that the FBI is doing. So, rather than just, saying, we think this is happening, this is proof that it's happening. And there's no reason that it should be your obligation to go talk to the FBI about it. You pay your taxes, you have an elected representative, go to him and say, look, you need to talk to the FBI about this program and tell them that you represent us and you're not going to allow them to continue doing this. And then also, supporting the groups in the community that are fighting for your rights, like CAIR and the ACLU and others, and supporting other groups. This isn't just the Muslim community who is under this kind of microscope. The environmental rights community is under this kind of microscope. The labor movement is under this kind of, so making sure that you're working, when it's some other community whose rights are being affected, whether it's, with secure communities in the Latino community, and going out and standing up for them. will make it a lot easier for all of us to work together.
U.S. citizens always have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. You also always have the right to re-enter the country. Of course, you're most vulnerable at the border because you're tired, you're exhausted, you're jet-lagged, and you really just want to go home. And we have seen various agencies take advantage of that vulnerability by asking a lot of questions that maybe they wouldn't ask you otherwise and that you wouldn't answer otherwise. Unfortunately, there isn't a sort of a clear line in the sand because you do have to prove who you are and that you are admissible to the country. The thing that we say to people is you'll know when the question crosses the line. My brother has been asked, are you Sunni or Shia? Who paid for your trip to Saudi Arabia? Were your parents religious growing up? Those questions are sort of very obviously crossing the line, and it is really important to assert your rights at that point because the information that you're sharing at the border, even if it's not with the FBI, is shared with other agencies afterwards. So we've had people who will answer seemingly innocent questions about their Islamic studies travels in Africa and the Middle East just to get through, and then a few months later be visited by the FBI because there are follow-up questions. And so we, of course, remind people to assert their rights even at the border.
And we were actually trying at the ACLU to get the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General to investigate the religious questioning because there were a lot of, I'm sure, some of you have gotten these questions about how Sunni or Shia, where do you pray, how often do you pray? Those sort of things are totally inappropriate for law enforcement to be asking.
But they ask this question even when I go for citizenship or marriage interview. In particular, in a marriage interview, they'll ask questions that are very inappropriate. So my job as the attorney is, do I cross the line and piss off the officer
right.
who's going to deny it, or do I just say, okay, what do I do? And I have had to, I'm going to stop stand of questioning.
Right.
Have the supervisor come in willing to find out to strike the question. So there's a fine line in every situation. Like Zara said, you'll know when it's appropriate.
Right.
But unfortunately, the fears on our side at that moment, you just don't have problems.
I think
right.
citizens have it safest as well. So one of the things that we saw a lot of in our community post 9/11 was this realization that you had all these people that had not naturalized, that they'd just been holding onto their green cards forever. And so that even that transition is important because you're safest on the other side of it. I can say, I won't answer your question and you can't hold this against me. And I can say that was sort of, because where are they going to send me? But a non-citizen doesn't have that same, and I hate to call it a luxury, but maybe the same rights. It's about noon now, and so we will wrap up out of respect for everyone's time. Thank you all so much for coming. I forgot to point these out. These are our newest little publications. They're pocket cards. A lot of people have a hard time remembering what to do, and this is a lot of information. These you can carry in your wallet. They have our phone number as well as just steps 1, 2, and 3 if you are ever visited by the FBI. We've printed lots of them, so if you think that there are people in your community, your family, your organization that could benefit, please feel free to take them. And then these white publications are a joint publication by CAIR, ACLU, and the Asian Law Caucus. They walk you through the various scenarios, what you should do. They have our phone numbers. We have the Muslim Day at the Capitol flyer. I'm sorry, I'm going through all of our publications. And because you're mosque leaders, even though we weren't talking about youth and bullying issues today, I did want to point out our school bullying report, which was published in December. You all have a copy to take with you. It gives you a sense of what Muslim youth are experiencing, because as much as we're experiencing issues with the FBI and Islamophobia, unfortunately there's also a trickle-down effect that impacts our young people, and so a sense of what's going on and how they're not even speaking up about what they're facing. And so jazakallah khair to everybody for coming.